So there's no doubt about it. IndyCar is at a crossroads with its new car or new regulations, whatever you want to call it. I think calling it a new car brings up a whole lot of different problems that we're going to talk about in this video. Because I think there is a bit of an ideological battle happening in IndyCar racing around its rules. Whether folks acknowledge that it's happening or not, I think it is happening. And that is, what is the role of the race car in IndyCar racing? And it sounds so weird to ask that question in auto racing, especially top-level auto racing, because that seems like it would be the most basic, fundamental thing to understand about your racing series. And yet, we have a question, and a question that is so obviously not been answered yet. And it's going to need to be answered when the next set of regulations come out. So there's a great article written today in the Indianapolis Star by Nathan Brown. It will be linked in the description. I wanted to talk about a few items mentioned in that article, a few quotes, but certainly read the entire thing because I certainly do not talk about or cover everything that is contained in that article. I think it gives a really good sense of where things are right now in terms of the discussion and the understanding between the team owners and the racing series itself about where the regulations are going, which is there ain't that much, and that's concerning. By the way, just real quick, you might notice that I'm in a bit of different digs right now. I'm actually in Michigan. There is some really cool content that I can't quite talk about yet, but that'll be coming tomorrow. I think you guys, especially those of you who have a historical sense and a love for history, especially history of the Indianapolis 500, you're going to like the video tomorrow. There's also a splash of modern in there, and that's all I can say so far. But check out the content tomorrow. DL 500 Club tonight at 8 p.m. Link in the description for that as well. So one of the things that I think a lot of people are, who are headline readers, looking at this article, are going to see a spicy quote from Chip Ganassi asking the question, why do we need a new car? And a lot of people, I think, are going to only read the headline and jump on Chip and say that Chip is the problem, or Chip is like trying to stop a new car from coming. That is not the case. And let me read the quote that really is, I think, the important one, and it kind of goes back to my thesis statement at the beginning of this video. What is an Indy car? Ganassi said this to Nathan Brown. I'm not saying we don't need a new car, but what's the fundamental reason for a new car? Why do we need one? Has that been defined? Is it a press thing? Is it a speed thing? Is it a safety thing? Is it a cost thing? Is it a fan thing? So what Chip is saying here is something that I've been saying for a very long time, and I think it's a very important point to bring up. It is all well and good, and I think we oversimplify it sometimes. That's why I've tried to, even though I've broken my rule already a couple of times in this video, is to not talk about 2027 or 2028 or 2029 or 2030 or whenever this new regulation set is coming, not talk about it as a car, because a car is just way too much of an oversimplification of what IndyCar needs right now. They don't need a new car. They need a new set of regulations. They need, in my opinion, now some people disagree. Some people are very, very happy with what IndyCar is right now, and they don't want anything to change. And that's cool. I'm happy for you. I think IndyCar needs a little bit more of a rule change than I think a lot of people realize. I think they need a little bit more radical thought. And there's at least one team owner that agrees with me, and we'll talk about that later. But we need to be talking about regulations and what those regulations are. And so when Chip brings up, what is a new car, and asks if it's been defined yet, he brings up things like press. Hey, I'm the press. The press needs things to talk about, and something that IndyCar struggles with so much, especially in the last, or the 6-month non-racing season. There's nothing to talk about. If there were new cars, new parts being tested, reasons for teams to go to Sebring and go to Phoenix and go to Homestead and go all over the country and test their race cars in the off-season, it would give us something to talk about. Oh, new spy shots just came out. Penske's running a new front wing. What's going to happen? We don't have any of that right now. In fact, most teams test twice a year now, not counting the Indianapolis 500 test, and then they're done. For the rest of the season, they're done. So from a press standpoint, for sure, I might be a little bit biased in saying, please, can we have something new? Because I think we all in the media need things to talk about. And if we don't have those, we're in big trouble. Is it a speed thing? You hear people so often talk about track records at Indianapolis. They could break that right now if they put the road course boost to them, but never mind. You talk about speed. You talk about the maneuverability of the car, particularly on the road and street courses. That's something the drivers are very strongly in favor of. I think there's some things you could do with the aerodynamics of the cars on the ovals to make them be able to race each other a little bit better. Maybe separate good cars from bad cars, not just have them run around a conga line the entire time. Wouldn't that be nice? There's a lot of things that you could do with the car from a speed to performance standpoint, for sure. Is it a safety thing? Is it a safety thing? What needs to be changed with IndyCar in terms of the safety? Sure, you can integrate more of the aeroscreen parts to make the car look a little more complete. Maybe focus a little more on driver cooling. Maybe more side intrusion protection. Maybe lighten the gearbox a little bit in the case of a rearward impact. There's all sorts of things you could do, but I don't think there's a pressing safety need right now with the chassis itself that IndyCar would need to address. And is it a fan thing? It depends on the fan that you ask, and depends on what you kind of think that people tune into auto racing to see. And we're going to get into the ideological discussion right now, because I think what you run into are two schools of thought. There's the school of thought that thinks the race car doesn't and shouldn't matter at all. It is all about the competition, how competitive that car can race against other cars, and how it showcases the talent of the drivers. And that's what people think 100% it should be. And I would say, where is IROC? Where is SRX? Where is A1GP? Where is Super League Formula? Do you get my drift? There's the other school of thought that the car does matter quite a bit in auto racing. You want it to continue to progress. This entire sport of ours started, although, it hasn't always been, but it began as a way for the automotive industry to prove new product. Now, it's changed quite a bit over the years. It's become more of an entertainment property than just a pure, development aspect or promotion of products. We understand that. But I think this thought process where we're talking about purely ignoring the factor of the race car in your product and trying to make them all exactly identical 100%, I think that is a very difficult prospect. First of all, it's almost an impossibility to achieve. And second of all, if you're a manufacturer, and you're trying to, let's say, keep a second manufacturer, bring in a third or a fourth or a fifth, if you have that kind of callous attitude towards the cars, why would that incentivize a manufacturer to invest in your series? That's a huge problem. So what was Mark Miles' answer to Chip Ganassi's question in the article? Well, Nathan Brown got a quote from it. And Miles said, "I think we can make the great racing better." Okay, that's fair. I think we can make a relatively safe race car safer. Again, admirable. I think we can actually better manage costs for teams. Sounds good on paper. And finally, I think the car is going to look great. Okay, surface level, I don't disagree with anything Mark Miles said right there. Those are admirable goals. Do any of those things move the needle at all? Maybe the car looking great. Maybe the racing. Depends on how much of an improvement the racing is. And of course, we need to pass the eye test when we're looking at racing. It's not just, how many on-track passes were there? Well, that's a bit of a silly metric, isn't it? It's all about how it looks. And yes, racing, we always need to be pursuing safer racing. I love that. Managing costs for the teams, okay, sure. How are you going to do that? we'll talk about managing costs here in just a little bit. The issue here, and again, Mark Miles is not a race car person, right? This is where we run into a little bit of issue. Like, for example, if we looked at another series, I mean, and I'm not the biggest Stefano Domenicali fan in the world. But if you hear him or like a Ross Brawn type talk about regulations in Formula One, they are looking at, what can we do to bring manufacturers in? What can we do to, kind of maintain the Formula One brand? Obviously, they talk about improving racing too, but there's more to it. There's more thinking about the sporting aspect of the race cars. You especially go to like sports car racing, whether it's Pierre Fillon with the ACO or whether it's John Doonan with IMSA. You're talking a little bit more nuts and bolts. And those are the sort of things, what can we do? If race car manufacturer, if OEMs are what you want, if I'm an OEM, I need to hear more than that. What about that appeals to an OEM? Right? What about that appeals to an OEM? Now, I suppose we could have the discussion if IndyCar is trying to restructure their business model to be less dependent or not dependent at all on OEMs. I think there's a really interesting discussion to be had there. But it doesn't sound like there's been any thought into like the 30,000 foot, like looking down on the scope of racing right now and understanding, okay, what are we as IndyCar? Are we about the teams? Are we trying to expand based on the charter system? No. It sure seems like they're happy with 25 and maybe 2 extra cars and then, fill the grid and maybe a couple extra at the Indy 500. It's not like Mark Miles is saying, we want to do a formula that's much cheaper, much more affordable. We want 50 cars at the Indy 500. We want 33 at every other race, and we're going to have bumping for the top 27. I don't hear that. So is it OEMs? Okay, well, if it's OEMs, what do the OEMs want? More often than not, it's torque sensors and BOP. If you're not doing that, what are we doing? What are we trying to accomplish? What are we trying? What is IndyCar? Back to Chip's question. We don't have it defined, and Mark Miles didn't define it. Is it his job to define it to the media? I think it is. I think you should define. You should say what you are, and then people will either jump on board or not jump on board. But right now, a big problem in IndyCar is that people like me, or people like you, or people like anybody else, has their idealized version of IndyCar. What we want IndyCar to be, what we believe it can be. And we project that vision of what we want IndyCar to be on IndyCar. And then when IndyCar doesn't live up to our expectations, we get upset. Again, messaging. Speaking of messaging, Bobby Rahal said this to Nathan Brown. I don't know anything about the new car other than what we learned 6 months ago. And at that point, it was, let's try to utilize as much of the existing car as possible. Cost savings, that was a Jay Fry thing. It might be out the window with Jay Fry gone. But why? Okay, so I understand, I guess, why the media or the fans, you could make an argument, right? Why are the team owners in the dark? How is it possible that Bobby Rahal can give that quote? That's insane. Let's go to a team owner that perhaps I agree with a little bit more, although it would be a risk. And IndyCar's a bit risk-averse. Dan Taurus, who now, of course, owns Andretti Global with the TWG Group, he said, we want to see the latest and greatest machine. We want to see something the fans are super excited about. The greatest response would be that they see something that competes with Formula One. Wouldn't that be something? I agree, Dan. I think that would be something. You might be one of the few team owners that can afford that. Now, I appreciate that. Listen, I'm definitely on Dan Towers' side here. That's, for me, you talk about David Land's idealized IndyCar racing, that's what it is. You're going to war with Formula One. You're going to win back the American open wheel fan in the United States. I don't know if you do it with a spec car. Maybe you could if you did V10s. But again, that's going to take vision. That's going to take defining what an IndyCar is. And they're not doing that right now. The final point is that the team owners are talking once again about cost. And, you know, Michael Shank in the video or in the article that Nathan wrote said, you know, we need a new car, but I'm also concerned about costs. And that's where I go, and that's where we're struggling. Again, going back to the very beginning of this video, there's the problem. You want to define IndyCar and you want to make IndyCar great and all this XYZ, but then you also want to contain cost, maybe go to a formula where you're using a significant amount of the DW12 chassis, which has been around obviously since 2012. It concerns me. And of course, here's the other thing to think about when we talk about OEMs. A lot of people don't talk about this enough, but like NASCAR is also doing new regulations, and their plan right now is to debut their new regulations around the time that IndyCar will. So if you're talking about like the race to keep OEMs or maybe bring new OEMs in, time's a ticking. And right now, IndyCar, as crazy as it is to say, at least on the technical side, it's a series that doesn't have an identity. And until we get that identity, we're not going to know how to sell it to OEMs or new teams or whatever the vision is for IndyCar racing going forward. I hate to be pessimistic, but that doesn't give me a ton of optimism, at least now. Hopefully, once they unveil the new regulations, I'll have something positive to say. Until then, tune in tomorrow for a really cool video from Detroit. And I'll actually be appearing on IndyCar Radio a couple of times this week. I'm going on for first practice and morning warm-up with the Thermal Club Grand Prix, and we're also going to be streaming the race on the DL 500 Club. So stay tuned for that. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.